From today, you are not our daughter anymore." My mother said into the microphone as my family clapped like they were applauding a show not cutting a human being out of their bloodline. The sound echoed off the crystal walls of Hillcrest Country Club in Austin, blending with the warm yellow glow of the chandeliers and the lingering scent of peach cake from my grandmother Ruth's 80th birthday celebration. 40 guests straightened their backs. Some whispered. Some lifted their phones. My sister Heather lifted hers the highest, angling it to catch my face, as if she expected me to shatter right there in front of the banner that said, "Happy 80 Ruth." My mother Linda stood tall on the small stage, her hair sprayed into perfect stillness. My father Mark held her elbow with the pride of a man delivering an award. I stood below them, a step down, a step lower, the place they always kept me, without saying it out loud. My mother cleared her throat and read from a white sheet of paper held delicately between her manicured fingers. "It is the decision of the Harper family that Camille will no longer have access to the family fund and will no longer be considered an eligible beneficiary. We are cutting her off financially and formally." She paused to let the words sink in for the crowd. Some gasped. One woman murmured, "Poor thing." Another murmured, "I knew something was wrong with that quiet one long ago." My father added his part. "You chose your own path, Camille. Now you live with it." Heather zoomed in even closer, waiting for me to fall apart so she could post it later and laugh with her friends about the sister who never lived up to the Harper brand. I felt the room tilt slightly, not because I was weak, but because betrayal delivered with applause is a different kind of strike, a colder one. A deeper one. It felt like being shoved out of a moving car, then asked to wave goodbye politely, but my voice came out steady. "So this is official." My mother nodded with satisfaction. "Yes, official, in front of everyone." I took the paper from her hand and folded it twice. It slid into my bag next to something they did not know existed. I had flown back from New York only 3 days earlier. I had spent 48 hours in conference rooms with glass walls and men in suits negotiating a deal that no one in this room even imagined I could be part of. I had signed papers that held numbers my parents could not comprehend. I had shaken hands with people who knew my name even if my own family treated it like a footnote. But I said none of that. They did not deserve the satisfaction of hearing a single explanation. To them, I was still just Camille, the quiet girl who played with spreadsheets and drank cheap coffee in cheap apartments. They had no idea that half the people in the country club had driven on highways my algorithm had made safer without ever knowing who designed it. They had no idea that the fund they were cutting me from held less money than my last performance bonus. They had no idea that the daughter they dismissed was the only one in the family capable of reading the financial pitfalls they themselves were blindly walking into. I looked at my grandmother Ruth, whose eyes glistened the way old eyes do when they see something others do not. She reached for my hand when I leaned down to hug her. "I know they are wrong," she whispered. "One day they will understand what they threw away." I squeezed her hand gently before stepping back. My family waited for a reaction, a tear, a crack, a collapse, something they could use to justify what they had just done. But there was nothing for them to collect, only my silence, which was more powerful than anything I could have said. I stood still for one more moment and watched them bask in their own performance. Then I turned and walked toward the hallway that led out of the banquet room. Every step felt like stepping out of a story they had written without my consent. They thought they were erasing a failure. They thought they were cutting loose the child who never shined bright enough. They had no idea they had just severed the only person who understood their real numbers. As the door closed behind me, I exhaled slowly and felt something settle inside me. Not pain, not fear, something sharper, something quieter. If your own family has ever turned you into the villain of their little story, stay with me. This is the night the toxic family finally met the beginning of their own family betrayal ledger. I grew up in Round Rock on the quiet northern edge of Austin, where every street seemed to glow with the same soft Texas heat, and every family pretended to be something polished on Sundays. And in that world, my parents perfected the art of favoring one child while shaping the other into a shadow. My father Mark built houses for a living and acted as though the walls he put up made him king of every room he entered. He believed money was law, and law was unquestionable, especially when he was the one holding the checkbook. My mother, Linda, lived for the approval of the church ladies and the neighborhood gatherings, always telling them how blessed and perfect her family was, even though perfection only seemed to include my sister Heather, whose cheerleader smile could melt anyone, and whose future as a lawyer was announced as if the entire county had been waiting for the news. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the odd one, the girl who liked notebooks filled with numbers and patterns, the girl who asked questions. No one cared to answer the girl. My parents shrugged off as if curiosity were a flaw that embarrassed them. At dinner, Heather always sat closest to Mark, both of them laughing loudly while Linda placed dishes on the table and said, "Heather is our star," while letting the words hang just long enough before adding, "and Camille is our quiet one." And my father would smirk and say, "Nobody pays you for being quiet, kiddo," then laugh as if humiliation were a form of affection. I learned early that praise flowed in one direction, and that my worth sat somewhere behind Heather's hair appointments and weekend competitions. I learned to keep my face steady even when the room tilted slightly with unfairness. Holidays made the gap even clearer because Heather always received new dresses that sparkled under Christmas lights, while Linda handed me the camera and said, "You take such good pictures, honey," as if documenting Heather's life were my only useful contribution. Pictures of Heather blowing out candles, Heather holding trophies, Heather standing center frame while I stayed behind the lens, invisible even when I stood 2 feet away. And the college fund was their favorite topic, because they loved to boast that Heather had a dedicated account for her future as a lawyer, an investment in the Harper legacy, while I had never seen my name on any document, any statement, any plan that suggested my education mattered at all. When I asked gently why I was never listed, Linda said, "If there is anything left after Heather is done, we will see." And she said it the way someone might talk about leftover food, something unimportant that could be tossed if necessary. I tucked that sentence somewhere deep because children know the tone of disregard long before they understand the meaning of it. Growing up as the second daughter in a home that celebrated the first felt like being stationed in a quiet corner, expected to excel without demanding space, expected to achieve without needing applause, expected to shrink so the golden child could glow brighter. Women in their 50s who hear this kind of story always nod because they lived versions of it too. They know the bruise of being overlooked, the sting of being told to be grateful for crumbs while someone else feasts. My own ledger of unfairness began long before I understood numbers as power. It began with those small moments when I realized that love in our house was measured and distributed like an allowance I was never approved for. Mark loved showing off Heather to guests who visited after church. He would stand by the kitchen counter and say, "Heather will be a lawyer. She will protect our inheritance. She will keep this family strong." And every time he said inheritance, his eyes gleamed in a way that suggested money mattered far more than affection. I would be in the sink, washing glasses, my hands warm under the water, listening to every word, letting each syllable carve deeper proof into the story I was starting to recognize. One evening, after such a gathering, Uncle Henry lingered behind as people said their goodbyes. He leaned closer to me near the doorway and asked, "So, what about you, sweetheart? What do you want to do?" And the question felt rare, almost like someone handing me my own name. I smiled a small smile because I was still young enough to believe humor could soften truth. And I said I keep the numbers straight so they do not go to jail. And Henry burst out laughing, not mocking, but genuinely tickled, while Mark stiffened behind him, uncomfortable that someone saw value in the daughter he had consigned to the background. It was a tiny moment, a small shift in the air, but I felt it, the faint satisfaction of watching my father miscalculate the first flicker of power in a house where I had none. This was my first mini revenge, subtle, not planned, a small return of balance disguised as wit. And even though it changed nothing about the hierarchy of the Harper home, it stayed with me because it proved that truth delivered softly could still cut in the right direction. Later that week, I walked past the den and overheard Linda speaking to a friend on the phone, her voice low but sharp enough to carry. "We just have one real chance in this family, and it is Heather," she said, as if the rest of us were expired coupons. Something in me went still like a lake at night. No ripple, only clarity. I did not cry or confront or storm away. I simply stood there absorbing the statement, fully letting it draw the first official line in the mental ledger I was beginning to keep, a ledger where I recorded losses, favoritism, dismissals, the emotional arithmetic of a home that taught me exactly where I ranked. I did not know then how important that ledger would become, or how many entries would be added in the years that followed. But in that moment, I understood one thing with absolute certainty, that the Harper family valued one daughter and tolerated the other, and that someday, somehow, the imbalance they built so confidently would be measured against a truth they could not manipulate. I entered college in the fall of 2013 carrying the same quiet discipline I had relied on my entire childhood, because I knew no one in the Harper house would magically decide I was worth investing in. So I learned to invest in myself, and Texas State became the first place where my name felt like it belonged to me. Rather than a footnote in someone else's story, I earned a scholarship in finance and data analytics and picked up a part-time job at a small cafe on campus where the espresso machine hissed louder than any criticism my parents ever lobbed at me. And between shifts, I took small freelance projects, building reports for local businesses, because numbers were the only language that did not lie to me the months past, and every paycheck I earned went into a savings account I guarded carefully, every tip stuffed into an envelope, every freelance payment logged in a spreadsheet, and by my junior year I had quietly saved $18,000, a sum that felt like proof I could build a future without anyone's permission. But when Linda visited one weekend, she looked at me with that soft, pitying smile she always used when she was about to disguise control as concern. And she said, "A young woman managing her own bank account is not always safe." She said, "Let me help you open a joint account so I can make sure everything stays protected since I have experience, and you are just good with numbers." Her tone, sliding the compliment into a subtle insult, and I was worn down by years of being told she knew best, so I let her take me to the bank and sign the papers, even though my stomach tightened the entire time as if my instincts were shouting through a closed door. For months, everything seemed fine. My balance grew little by little as I worked late nights at the cafe and spent early mornings finishing analytics assignments. And then one Tuesday afternoon in March of 2015, I opened my banking app between classes and froze because the account showed $400. I blinked, refreshed. The screen checked the statements and saw several transfers. I had never made each labeled with Linda's authorization. The money routed straight into an account listed under Heather Harper escrow fee legal expenses, all dressed up as if my savings existed solely to sponsor my sister's ambitions. I left class early and called the bank, and the representative confirmed with a calm voice that the withdrawals were valid due to joint account permissions. And I sat there on a bench near the library with the Texas sun beating down on my shoulders, feeling the air squeeze out of my lungs because 15 years of being second had just been converted into a financial transaction. I drove home that weekend and confronted Linda in the kitchen, my voice steady despite the tremor inside me, and I said that was my savings every hour I worked, every report I built, and she looked at me as if I were a child misunderstanding a rule and said, "No, money in this house flows to where it is needed. Most, your sister is our investment." And Mark, sitting at the table thumbing through his mail, chimed in without looking up, saying, "If you are as smart as you claim, you will make it back. It is not a big deal." And there it was again, that casual dismissal that rubbed out my effort as though it were chalk on a sidewalk. I walked to my old bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the bank statement spread across my lap, my breath tight, my hands cold, and then my phone vibrated with a message from Heather, a message so sharp it almost made me laugh, because cruelty wrapped in sweetness is still cruelty. And she wrote, "You are good with numbers. You will be fine. Think of it as your contribution to my career." And I read it twice, letting every word settle with the weight of truth I had denied for too long, because this was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a choice, a family decision made behind my back that told me exactly how they ranked me. And in that moment, something inside me hardened in a way that would never soften again. I took photos of every statement, every transfer, every note, and created a folder on my laptop titled Harper Internal Losses. The first time I documented the financial injustice they imposed on me, a seed of conflict, justice, and story financial that would one day grow into something they could never control. When I returned to campus, I felt hollow for a few days, working my shifts on autopilot studying, while pretending I had not just lost the tangible proof of my independence, but anger has its own kind of energy, and within a week I felt myself sharpen, more determined to rebuild what they stole. And that new resolve became a quiet shield I carried everywhere. A few months later, Linda held a small gathering with neighbors to celebrate Heather's acceptance into law school. A gathering filled with soft praise and wine glasses clicking, and Linda's familiar voice floating above it all as she said, "We sacrificed so much for Heather's law school," and something in me cracked in a way that was almost sweet because I stepped forward, keeping my tone light but clear, and said mostly, "My savings, but sure, we works." And the room shifted with a silence so tiny most people missed it. But Mrs. Davenport, the elderly neighbor who never missed a detail, turned her eyes toward Linda with a suspicion that made Linda's smile wobble for just a second. It was a small revenge, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to remind me that truth spoken softly in the right moment can be devastating. And as I drove back to campus that night, I realized the first drop in my story had already happened, not with a dramatic crash, but with the quiet click of numbers leaving my account. And though my parents believed I would simply accept it and move on what they did not understand, was that the loss had awakened something powerful in me, something patient, something that remembers every imbalance and waits for the moment when the ledger finally settles. Graduating should have felt like a clean break from everything the Harper house had carved into me. Yet when I stepped into my first job as a junior analyst and earned a salary that was modest but steady, I realized my family still saw me as free labor, waiting to be summoned whenever their world needed smoothing. So while my days were spent decoding patterns in corporate spreadsheets, my weekends were swallowed by Linda's endless requests to help set up church events, or decorate Heather's baby showers, or run errands she did not trust anyone else to handle. And every time Mark received a thick envelope of financial reports from his construction company, he would send me a message saying, "Look at these numbers for me real quick," as if my career existed solely for his convenience. And what struck me most was how easily they shifted between using me in private and erasing me in public. Because the moment guests walked through the door, Mark would puff his chest and Linda would lift her chin and Heather would glide into the room like a polished trophy, while I stood with a tray of glasses or a stack of plates, since they always found a way to place something in my hands. When the introductions began, Linda's voice inevitably floated out like a rehearsed script. "This is Heather, our lawyer," she said with pride swelling in every syllable, and then she tilted her head toward me with an apologetic smile, as if I were an afterthought stuck to the bottom of the conversation, and said, "And this is Camille." She helps out a phrase that sliced in its softness because it sounded harmless, yet carried the full weight of dismissal and being reduced to "she helps out" after years of degrees and certifications made the room tilt slightly every time. The humiliation did not stop there because one Saturday afternoon during a family barbecue with neighbors filling the backyard, Mark stood by the grill with his beer raised and announced loudly, if Camille ever stops overthinking, she might finally make $1, and laughter rippled through the crowd as if my effort were a punchline. And before I even had time to swallow that sting, Linda chimed in with her favorite anecdote about the time I cried over losing my savings, telling it with exaggerated hand gestures, like she was recounting a comedic mishap instead of financial betrayal. And the whole group laughed again, not knowing they were laughing at the moment that had cracked something foundational inside me, a moment I had rebuilt myself from. Each time I tried to speak up, they called me sensitive. Each time I tried to correct the narrative, they said I remembered wrong. And one evening after dinner, I asked Linda calmly why she still joked about my savings when it was clear it hurt me. And she sighed with exasperation, saying, "You really need to let go. Families share only selfish people keep score." And I stood there nodding, even though in my mind I pictured the spreadsheet tucked away on my laptop, the one where I had cataloged every withdrawal and every humiliation with mathematical precision. Because if they insisted on teaching me the language of accounting emotionally, then I would keep a ledger that told the truth. It was during one of these weekends at home when Mark tossed a stack of tax documents onto the kitchen counter and said, "Check this quickly before I send it to the accountant. Since you understand these things, and after years of being conditioned to obey, I began scanning the paperwork, but the deeper I read, the more I realized the numbers did not match the narrative he boasted about, because several liabilities were underreported, and certain expenses had been categorized in ways that could raise serious legal questions if the wrong auditor saw them. And as I traced each discrepancy with my finger, a slow awareness settled over me. The same man who mocked my career and belittled my cautious nature would have walked straight into compliance trouble if someone like me had not been quietly catching the errors he pretended did not exist, and the irony burned so sharply it almost tasted sweet. Sitting there under the dim kitchen light with those forms spread before me, I understood something decisive, something that clicked like a lock turning into place. If my own family had no problem taking from me, mocking me, and exposing me to public embarrassment whenever it suited them, then I owed them nothing of my future, nothing of my talent, nothing of my earnings. And from that second forward, every valuable thing I built would exist outside their reach, protected in private, far from the grasping hands of the Harper house, a promise that shaped every decision I made afterward. The shift inside me was quiet and powerful, and it colored the next conversation I had with Mark when he asked me to revise a projection sheet for his meeting with the bank, saying he needed the numbers to look clean and optimistic because appearances matter in business. And I opened the file and saw instantly that he wanted me to smooth out figures that were never meant to be smoothed, to polish risks into illusions, so his company would look stronger. And instead of bending the data like he expected, I entered the real numbers with careful accuracy, ensuring every line reflected the truth, because truth is the one thing he never respected. And when he submitted the reports, the bank responded by requesting additional collateral and noting concerns about debt ratios, which made Mark storm around the kitchen, ranting about incompetent analysts and unnecessary caution. When he confronted me demanding to know why I had not made the numbers more presentable, I looked at him with a steadiness that surprised even me and said, "Real numbers do not care about your speeches, Dad." And though he scoffed and told me I was too rigid, something flickered in his eyes, a small crack in his certainty because somewhere deep down he knew I was right, and the world outside his control would never bend to charm or ego the way his household did. I drove back to my apartment that evening with the windows down, letting the warm Austin air steady my breathing. And as I replayed the day in my mind, I felt the loops and turns, tightening, each humiliation shaping me, each instance of gaslighting, sharpening my instincts. And with every mile I drove, my conviction grew stronger that whatever wealth or influence I eventually acquired would remain mine alone, untouched, by the people who saw me as nothing more than a backup plan or a shadow trailing behind Heather, and that realization was the beginning of a silent transformation. The moment I stopped surviving their treatment and started preparing for the day the entire ledger would flip. By the time 2020 arrived, I had grown accustomed to the quiet imbalance of my life, carrying the weight of my family's dismissiveness in one hand and my own small victories in the other. But when the pandemic swept through the country and companies tightened their budgets, my world shrank again and I felt myself sliding into a tunnel with no rails to hold on to, because Pathline announced sudden cuts that sliced away part of my income and left me staring at bills that stacked higher each week, the rent notice on my kitchen counter glowing like a warning light, while my student loan reminders kept pinging my phone. And in the middle of that chaos, my roommate was hit by a car while biking home from her shift, leaving her with a hospital bill that drained the savings she had. So I sat on the edge of my bed late one night and thought, maybe this is finally the moment when my family might act like a real family. Maybe they would understand compassion when it was not wrapped in performance or financial advantage. And the next morning I called home with a tightness in my voice I tried to hide as I said, "Dad, Mom, can I use a small part of the Harper Family Support Fund to help cover my roommate's hospital fees? I will repay every dollar as soon as I can." And the silence on the line was brief but heavy before Mark exhaled and said that fund is for emergencies that affect the whole family, not friends, not outside people. And Linda added in a tone smooth enough to bruise you without leaving a mark that you chose to live with strangers instead of staying home. This is part of your independence, and the dismissal landed so fully that I had to sit down. Because it was not even for me that I asked, it was for someone who had no one else, someone I thought they would at least be willing to help in the spirit of decency. Yet I was reminded once again that decency in the Harper house was conditional, was awarded only when it fit their image. I hung up with a nod they could not see and stared at the ceiling, feeling the kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from realizing the people who raised you would not lift a finger, even when the effort required barely counted as effort, and the ache that bloomed in my chest was familiar, because it echoed the same ache so many women carry, the ache of giving endlessly, while receiving almost nothing in return. The ache of watching the people you love measure your worth in terms you never agreed to. The twist came 3 days later when Heather posted a photo of her new SUV on social media, the caption bragging about how sometimes you just have to treat yourself. And when I visited home that weekend, Linda casually mentioned over coffee that Heather used a chunk of the family fund to pay off her credit card bill, because big purchases sometimes create temporary debt. Then Linda smiled as if this allocation of money were noble and said it is different for Heather. She has children. She is the future of this family. And I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat because the same fund that could not spare $500 for a genuine medical emergency had effortlessly covered Heather's impulsive spending, and something tightened inside me so sharply I had to look away before I revealed what I truly felt. I kept my expression calm the way I always did, and later that afternoon when we celebrated my nephew's birthday in the backyard, I brought a small cake I paid for myself, placing it gently on the table, and Linda gave me that thin smile and said, "You did not need to do that." And I replied with a softness so polite it almost disguised the blade beneath it. "I know I do not expect the family fund to reimburse me," and two of our cousins standing nearby went silent, their eyes flicking between us as Linda's mouth tightened, because sometimes the quietest sentences are the ones that land the hardest. After the party ended, I drove back to my apartment under a sunset that looked too peaceful for the heaviness in my chest, and when I reached home, I left the lights off and sat at my desk, with only the glow of my laptop filling the room. The air still enough to feel like a pause in my life, the kind of pause that comes before a decision that changes everything. And I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it Harper Debits and Credits. the words appearing at the top of the screen like an indictment, and I began typing slowly at first, then faster as I listed every moment they had taken something from me, every request they had refused, every investment poured into Heather, every time Linda dismissed my feelings as sensitivity, every instance where generosity flowed one direction and expectation flowed the other. And the further I typed, the steadier my breath became, because documenting the truth gave me a kind of control I had never felt before. With each line, the pattern became clearer, the imbalance unmistakable, the emotional arithmetic undeniable. And I realized that this dark tunnel was not only about financial strain, but also about the stark illumination of how lopsided my family's love had always been. And in that awareness, I felt both grief and clarity: grief for the family I had never truly had, and clarity about the family I would never again fight to be part of. I saved the file quietly and leaned back, letting the soft hum of my laptop settle the storm inside me, thinking about how toxic family dynamics can hollow out even the strongest people, how conflict justice often begins not with confrontation, but with recognition, how revenge emotional is not always loud and fiery, but sometimes slow and silent, and born from the steady realization that you deserve better than the place you were assigned. And as I closed my eyes, the tunnel did not feel as dark as before, because for the first time I could see the faint outline of an exit, a future I would build without relying on anyone who had shown me repeatedly that they could watch me struggle and feel nothing. By the time I settled into the quiet rhythm of 2021, I found myself moving differently, not with the frantic energy of someone trying to earn approval, but with the steady focus of someone who had finally accepted that approval was never coming. And when Pathline Analytics reached out with an offer to join them as a senior risk analyst, something inside me flickered to life, in a way I did not fully understand at first, because it was the first time a company saw me not as a helper or a backup or a convenient problem solver, but as someone with measurable value, someone whose mind could shift systems, not just patch holes. So I accepted the offer and walked into a world where numbers were not used to control me, but to open possibilities. At Pathline, my work centered around optimizing transportation routes, analyzing collision data, and building statistical models that predicted risk with surprising accuracy. And for the first time, the spreadsheets felt like more than survival. They felt like possibility, a kind of quiet influence that moved beneath the surface of the country's roads. During a Zoom meeting one morning, the CEO leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression as he studied the preliminary results of our new algorithm, which we called Root Shield. And he said, "If this model works at scale, we are looking at multi-million savings for our clients." And something about the way he said it, calm but certain, made my pulse quicken. Because no one in my childhood home had ever spoken about my work with that kind of respect. No one had ever looked at something I built and seen long-term impact, and hearing it now felt like a window cracking open in a room I had not realized was suffocating me. I spent weeks refining the model, adjusting variables, running complex simulations late into the night, with only the glow of my monitor lighting my apartment. And one evening, around midnight, the results loaded onto the screen, showing a projected savings of over $4.8 million for a single large transportation network. And I sat still for a long moment, letting the number settle over me, not as a fantasy or a hypothetical, but as something directly tied to my work, to my logic, to my patience. And I whispered softly into the empty room, "This belongs to something I built." I should have been able to share that excitement with family, but when they heard I was at a startup, their reaction slid exactly where I expected. Mark laughed in that dismissive way that always felt like a door closing and said, "So you are still playing with numbers on a screen as if my entire career were an elaborate hobby." And Linda shook her head with a weary sigh, saying, "You are almost 30. "Camille, when are you going to have something real? A ring, a husband, a house listing, milestones she valued like they were universal truths." And I simply nodded because I had learned that their definitions of real had nothing to do with the things that made me feel grounded or capable or alive. The twist arrived a few weeks later when the CEO asked me to join a closed call with executives from one of the largest logistics insurance groups in the country. And during that meeting, they asked detailed questions about Root Shield, its predictive power, its scalability. And when I finished explaining the underlying mathematics, the vice president leaned forward and said they were prepared to make an offer for exclusive licensing rights, an arrangement that would include equity and a personal payout projected at $4.8 million. And I felt my heartbeat shift into a steady thrum because the number that had once appeared as a line on my simulation screen was now beginning to take shape as something real, a life-changing asset with my name attached to it. I did not accept immediately, though. Instead, I requested a formal contract review by an intellectual property attorney, insisting that any agreement must list my name as the originator of the core algorithmic framework. And the attorney praised me for my caution, saying many people sign too quickly when dazzled by a large number. And I realized again that the instinct my family mocked, the carefulness, the overthinking, was the very thing safeguarding my future. Meanwhile, life at home continued its usual performance, and one Sunday dinner, Mark proudly announced to the extended family that Heather had handled a $200,000 case that month, bragging as though she had personally rewritten federal law, and Linda turned to me with a teasing smile that barely concealed her condescension and asked, "What about you, Camille, still staring at spreadsheets?" And I let a small smile tug at my lips as I replied something like, "That some spreadsheets are worth a little more than $200,000, though." And the table erupted in polite laughter, assuming it was a joke. Unaware that the truth sat quietly in my chest, like a lit fuse waiting for the moment the room would finally see the scale of what they had overlooked. I watched their laughter fade into casual conversation, feeling neither angry nor hurt, but strangely calm, because for the first time I was beginning to understand my own power. Not the loud performative power my parents chased, but the kind that grows slowly hidden from view until the moment it shifts everything. And as I drove home that night, the Austin skyline glowed against the dark sky reflections shimmering on the river. And I felt a certainty settle into my bones, a certainty that the life I was building no longer needed their permission or approval, a certainty that the next chapter of my story would be written entirely outside their reach. The morning of the signing felt unreal in a way that made every sound sharper. The tap of my heels in the marble hallway, the soft hum of the elevators rising through the glass tower, the quiet click of the conference room door as I stepped inside and saw the long table gleaming beneath the overhead lights, where the CEO, the CFO, 2 attorneys, and a representative from the logistics group waited with polite nods. And even though my pulse beat steadily beneath my skin, I felt strangely calm, almost anchored, because I had spent years preparing myself to survive disappointment. And now I was finally standing in a moment where nothing could be taken from me by someone else's whim. The contract sat open on the table, dozens of pages arranged with meticulous clarity. My name printed in bold, where the ownership of Root Shield's intellectual property was defined. And when the attorney slid the final page toward me, with a quiet "take your time," I felt a weight lift from my chest as I signed my name with deliberate care, recognizing that it was the first signature of my life, not tied to a family obligation, not tied to guilt or expectation, but tied to the value of my own mind. When the CFO announced that the transfer would be processed immediately, I nodded, unsure how to express the strange blend of disbelief and serenity threading through me. And after the meeting ended, I stepped into the cool hallway and opened my banking app and watched as the notification appeared, transferring $4,800,000 into an account bearing only my name. And I stood there for a moment, breathing slowly because the number did not feel loud or overwhelming. It felt precise, earned, almost quiet in its finality. a kind of stillness I had never experienced before, and I whispered in my mind, "This is 100% mine. No one in that toxic family even knows it exists." I left the building and sat in my car for a few minutes, letting the sunlight warm the steering wheel, then drove to a separate bank across town where I opened a new account under strict privacy settings, declining the family-linked features. They offered setting passwords I knew no one could guess, and afterward I met with a trust attorney who helped me establish a private trust with my name as the sole beneficiary, structuring it in layers that would keep every cent far outside the reach of Mark's demands, Linda's guilt tactics, and Heather's entitlement. And when the documents were complete, I felt a quiet sense of protection settle into my bones. That afternoon, I invested a portion of the money into a conservative portfolio, placing a smaller portion into a fund, supporting transportation safety research, and allocating a final piece to Pathline, because I believed in the company that believed in me, and each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had never been allowed to own. I returned to my apartment that evening, sat on the sofa in the soft light of sunset, and held my phone loosely as I reread the signed contract twice, not out of disbelief, but out of gratitude for the fact that I had built something powerful enough to carry me into a life not defined by the Harper family ledger. The escalated twist came hours later as I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of pasta when my phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications from the family group chat, a place I rarely looked at anymore. And when I opened it, I saw Mark's message glowing at the top saying, "Camille, if you ever do well enough, remember your family comes first, and we will need someone to help us keep the Harper inheritance together." A sentence dripping with entitlement, spoken as if the inheritance had ever included me, and before I could even react, Linda chimed in beneath him saying, "Yes. Think of it as paying back all the times we supported you," placing the word "supported" in quotes as if mocking the idea of accountability. I stared at their messages, feeling a strange mixture of amusement and exhaustion, because only a few hours earlier I had signed a deal worth more than anything they had ever allowed me access to. And somehow, they still believed they had a claim on whatever future I created, and I typed my reply slowly, letting each word rest lightly on the screen. "Do not worry. I am taking good care of my numbers," and when I hit send, I felt a subtle thrill. A quiet revenge that did not need volume or explanation, just truth delivered with unmatched calm. Moments later, Heather sent me a private message asking if I could help her with a client report, saying she needed the numbers adjusted slightly to make the financials look more appealing, and that it would only take me a minute because I am good with numbers. And I felt a familiar flicker of disappointment because even now she assumed my skills existed for her convenience. But this time, I felt nothing but clarity as I typed my response, keeping my tone professional and unshakably calm. "I cannot do that, Heather. I like my license and my ethics intact," and the silence that followed her read receipt felt like a small but meaningful victory. I closed my laptop that evening, letting the quiet of my apartment wrap around me like a soft shield, thinking about how for years my family had used numbers to reduce me, to diminish me, to measure me by metrics that erased my worth. Yet now the very thing they once mocked had become the key to a life none of them could touch, and I realized that secrecy was no longer a burden, but a form of self-protection, a way to ensure that the truth of my success remained mine until I chose to reveal it. As the night deepened and the city lights flickered against the windows, I felt the certainty settle deeper into me. The awareness that this deal was more than money. It was freedom. It was distance. It was the moment the ledger shifted back into balance, and I knew that one day, when the full truth surfaced, they would understand not only what they had lost, but what they had pushed away. And for the first time in my life, that knowledge felt less like vengeance and more like peace, the kind of peace that grows only when you stop apologizing for your worth. By the time the deal money settled into its quiet places and my life began moving on a steadier axis, I felt something shift inside me. Not a burst of anger or triumph, but a slow, blooming certainty that I no longer needed to swallow every slight or pretend every insult was unintentional. And as the weeks passed leading up to my grandmother Ruth's 80th birthday celebration at Hillcrest, I found myself making small, precise decisions, the kind that cut cleanly without noise, the kind that rebalanced the ledger one careful line at a time, and none of them were illegal or dramatic, just quiet corrections to years of being taken for granted. The first one began with a credit card. Mark once pressured me into co-signing when I was 22, claiming it would help him earn points for business expenses and insisting it was harmless. But over the years, I watched the bills come through, showing charges from high-end stores and boutique shops, all belonging to Linda and Heather. And every time I asked about it, Mark brushed me off saying, "We are a family. We share things." Yet the responsibility for the account always fell on my shoulder since the card used my credit strength to boost theirs. So one quiet Tuesday morning before work, I called the bank, requested my name be removed from the account, asked them to close the card entirely, and requested a notation labeling Linda and Heather as not authorized users for any new credit product tied to my information. And the process took only 15 minutes, but it felt like breathing for the first time in years. A week later, Linda stood at a boutique counter trying to pay for a stack of dresses when the cashier informed her the card had been declined, and my phone lit up with her message written in that sharp tone she used when she felt embarrassed. "Why would you do that?" And I typed back without hesitation. "I thought we were cutting off unhealthy dependencies, letting the words land with the softness of truth rather than anger." And though she did not respond, I imagined her staring at the screen, realizing the balance of power had shifted in a direction she could not reverse. The second small revenge came in the form of reputation, a currency Linda guarded fiercely because her entire identity thrived on being admired in church circles. And every year, the Harper family made a show of donating to a local charitable fund, though in reality, it had been my private donation wired directly from my savings, while Linda accepted the praise as if the money had come from her accounts. And for years, I stayed silent because conflict felt exhausting. But this year, I quietly submitted the donation anonymously, rerouting both the payment and the acknowledgement, so the church treasurer could not link it to any Harper. And the following Sunday, when the pastor announced heartfelt gratitude to the anonymous donor whose generosity helped several struggling families, I watched the live stream from my apartment sipping coffee as Linda's smile flickered, then tightened, because the spotlight she relied on had vanished, and she could not claim credit for something she had never given. And though I felt a pang of melancholy for how predictable her reaction was, I also felt a sense of alignment, as if the truth had finally been allowed a place at the table. The third quiet shift arrived through Heather, who had become increasingly vocal in her neighborhood group, complaining publicly about minor inconveniences and calling out neighbors with a tone that felt entitled, even through screenshots. And one afternoon, my aunt forwarded one of Heather's posts to the family chat with a laugh, saying she is always so dramatic, and something in the back of my mind clicked because I recognized numbers and patterns, even in human behavior. So I reached out privately to the neighbor. Heather was targeting a woman named Julie, who was overwhelmed with work and unclear about the homeowners association, regulations, and after a brief conversation, I offered to help her compile a clean, formal complaint using the HOA rulebook organizing the document, with the same analytical clarity I brought to my job. And when Julie submitted it, the HOA reviewed it and ruled that Heather had violated several guidelines on property modifications, including a patio extension built without proper approval, forcing Heather to correct the issues and pay a small fine. And though no one knew I had been involved the moment Heather posted her frustration online again, I felt a quiet justice settle in my chest, a sense of karmic balance that asked for nothing more than accountability. These small steps were not fueled by bitterness, but by clarity, a recognition that my family had drawn lines for years, and it was time I drew mine, too gently, firmly, without apology. Amid these shifts came something unexpected, a call from my grandmother Ruth, who asked if I had time for a private lunch a week before her birthday celebration, and when I arrived, she was already seated on the patio of her favorite cafe, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her eyes soft with the kind of understanding that sees more than it asks. We talked about work, about the small garden she had started in her backyard, about the way time speeds up with age, and then after a quiet pause, she reached into her purse and pulled out a thin folder, smoothing it with a tenderness that made my throat tighten, and she leaned toward me slightly as she said, "I added a line to my will. No one knows it yet. But you." I sat still as she explained that the inheritance was not large, just a modest sum from her savings, but she wanted me to have it, not because she thought I needed it, but because she believed in fairness. Something she said had been missing far too long in our family, and she wanted me to know that someone saw me clearly. Someone recognized the years I had given without receiving the years I had survived quietly. I listened with warmth spreading across my chest because it was never about the money. It was the first time a family member offered something without conditions, without performance, without control. And as I hugged her goodbye, I felt a renewed certainty that everything I built must remain protected from the Harper house, because even the purest gestures could not erase the reality of how my parents and sister moved through the world. Driving home from that lunch, I felt the sky open wide above me, the road stretching forward like a promise. And although I knew the real reckoning had not yet come, I felt myself preparing for it with a calm steadiness, knowing that each quiet payback was not petty, but purposeful, resetting a balance that had been off for years, and I realized that when the moment arrived for the public confrontation at Hillcrest, I would be ready not with anger, but with truth, the kind of truth that turns a lifetime of condescension into a single freezing silence. When the evening at Hillcrest finally arrived, the air carried that polished quiet found only in places designed for people who mistake luxury for importance. And as I walked through the glass doors into the grand hall with its chandeliers glimmering like softened stars, I could feel the deliberate nature of every detail my parents had arranged, because Hillcrest was where they performed their pride and their power. The place where old acquaintances from Austin's business circles still believed the Harper family was united, successful, enviable. And I realized with a strange calm that this was exactly why Mark and Linda had chosen it, not for Ruth's birthday, not for celebration, but to stage a lesson they believed I needed to learn. The room buzzed with low conversation, the kind that wove through clinking glasses and practiced laughter, and across the tables I noticed familiar faces watching with polite curiosity, their gazes lingering a little longer on me as if they sensed something was about to happen while Heather stood near the stage, adjusting her phone, angling the camera toward the spot where Linda and Mark would make their announcement. Her smile sharpened with anticipation, like she was preparing a private little revenge, inheritance drama, family moment to post in her group chats later. When the microphone crackled to life and Linda stepped up in her pastel dress with a rehearsed graciousness, Mark positioning himself proudly beside her, the entire room softened into expectation, and I could feel every eye shift toward me as Linda cleared her throat and said in that sweet, airy tone she used when delivering cruelty wrapped in silk that they needed to address something important about the Harper family future. And then she turned toward me with a smile that gleamed too bright as she said, "Camille has chosen a path that no longer aligns with our family values, so we have made the difficult decision to formally cut her off from the Harper Fund." And Mark added quickly, as if eager to tighten the wound, "Yes, she will no longer be a beneficiary nor a participant in family financial matters. We are doing this for her own good," he said. And the room rippled with whispers, subtle glances exchanged across linen-covered tables, the kind of murmurs people make when witnessing a quiet public execution. I stood in the center of it all, my breath steady my posture, unbroken, And though I felt the sting of humiliation brush against my ribs, it did not cut me, because I had already lived through their worst long before this moment. And when Heather lifted her phone even higher, zooming in on my face, waiting for the collapse she had envisioned, I simply looked back at her with an expression so calm it made her blink in confusion. As I turned to leave the cluster of attention surrounding me, a voice called from behind, warm and familiar, and I saw Uncle Henry stepping forward, holding his phone, squinting at something on the screen, before clearing his throat loudly enough to draw the room's attention, and he said, "I am sorry, but I just came across an article about Pathline that mentions someone named Camille Harper. Is this you, dear?" And then he began reading aloud, his voice carrying across the hall with perfect clarity. Root Shield algorithm closes $4.8 million personal equity deal for lead analyst Camille Harper. The entire room fell silent, the whispers stopping mid-breath, the tension bending inward like the air had shifted its center of gravity, and I felt dozens of eyes snap toward me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Something in me steadied the silence settling into my bones like a familiar friend, and I turned back toward the center of the room, walked calmly to the nearest table, and set down the gray folder I had brought its contents, crisp and organized, and opened it slowly so the papers faced my parents. Inside were the signed contracts, the trust documentation, the official transfer confirmations, every piece of story financial evidence laid out with quiet precision. And I lifted my gaze to the room as I said, "You cut me off from a fund that would not cover even 1% of what I have already signed for my voice." Soft, but unwavering. And then added, "I am good, really good without you." A sharp inhale rose from somewhere in the back of the room, the kind that comes from witnessing something beautifully irreversible, and Mark attempted to laugh it off, lifting his glass slightly as he said, "Well, now that you are doing so well, maybe you can put some of that back into the family," trying to salvage his pride, as though this were all part of some harmless misunderstanding. But I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, that family cut me off on paper. Remember?" Letting the words settle with finality. Linda stepped forward, then her smile shaking at the edges, trying to regain control the only way she knew how, by leaning into emotional manipulation, and she said, "Camille, how can you be so cold to your own parents?" Her voice trembling as if she were the one who had been betrayed, but I answered with a level, steady tone that carried the weight of years I learned from the best, and the expression on her face stilled her mouth, softening into something frozen and empty, the room witnessing a kind of reckoning she could not talk her way out of. Heather lowered her phone inch by inch, her confidence dissolving as she realized the story she had tried to capture had transformed into one she never wanted filmed, and people around her shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to comfort her or pretend they had never aligned themselves with her smirking anticipation. Then I saw her, my grandmother Ruth, sitting quietly at her table, in a soft blue dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes warm and proud, as she watched me stand with a calm she had always hoped I would grow into, and she gave a small, slow nod, the kind that said, "This is justice. This is the balance coming back. This is the karma she had known would one day return." The room felt suspended for a moment, held in a breathless stillness where all the years of imbalance finally leveled themselves in a single undeniable truth. And as I gathered the folder back into my arms and stepped away from the center of the hall, I felt the weight of their narrative fall off me, completely replaced by a clarity I had earned line by line on my own. In the days after Hillcrest, the silence from my family felt less like distance and more like a mirror finally held up to their own choices. And while I went back to my apartment and resumed my life with the steady rhythm I had built for myself, the Harper household entered a slow unraveling that touched every corner of their carefully maintained image, because without someone quietly fixing their numbers, their stories, and their consequences, the cracks began to widen in ways they could no longer sweep aside. Mark was the first to feel the shift when a major construction project he had been boasting about for months was suddenly suspended due to irregularities noted by the bank, the same bank that used to overlook his sloppy reports because he always had someone like me adjusting the details behind the scenes. And now, without my eyes combing through his financials, the misclassifications he had brushed off as harmless began raising red flags, and when the bank requested clarified documentation, he attempted to scramble through the numbers alone only to make them more tangled, and by the time the project was officially put on hold, he was already blaming external forces without ever acknowledging that he had built his career on invisible scaffolding I had quietly maintained for years. Meanwhile, Heather found herself tangled in a case that hinged on financial documentation she swore was airtight, but when the opposing counsel highlighted inconsistencies in the reports, she had relied on her reputation as the meticulous lawyer of the Harper clan began to crumble. And though she attempted to revise the documents, her lack of understanding in the technicalities exposed her faster than she could patch the errors. And I heard through a relative that she had stormed out of her office one afternoon in tears, blaming stress, blaming colleagues, blaming anyone but herself. Soon enough, Mark and Linda reached out with messages that sounded more strained than apologetic, beginning with questions framed as concern and gradually shifting toward requests disguised as family unity. And one evening, I received a call from Mark who cleared his throat 3 times before saying, "Camille, your mother and I are dealing with some temporary financial strain." Nothing dramatic, of course, but if you could help with a short-term investment, maybe just something small to get us through the next quarter. And when I stayed silent, he shifted tactics, suggesting I sign as a guarantor on a property loan, insisting that it would only be for a short time, that it was what families do. And Linda later added through a separate message that perhaps I could reconsider the idea of sharing resources, because helping each other is the foundation of family. I replied gently but firmly, telling them I do not mix business with people who used public humiliation as parenting. And though the line was soft, its truth landed with a weight they could not cushion. And Linda sent a series of fragmented messages afterward, trying to pivot into emotional appeal. But I remained steady because I knew kindness without boundaries was simply obedience wrapped in hope. The escalation came when Mark tried to play the moral card, calling me late one night, with his voice low and strained as he said, children should take care of their parents, in old age letting the implication hang between us like a verdict. But I answered with a clarity sharpened by years of imbalance, saying parents should think of that before they sign their children out of the family in front of a microphone. And there was a long silence on the line afterward, the kind that reveals truth more powerfully than any raised voice ever could. In the weeks that followed, the consequences continued to ripple through their lives in ways subtle yet unmistakable. And Linda, who had spent decades curating her image through jewelry and designer collections, quietly sold several of her cherished pieces, the ones she once flaunted at church gatherings as symbols of stability. And though she told people she was decluttering, those who knew her well must have sensed the shift. Heather, who had pronounced herself a devoted mother, determined to provide only the best for her children, was forced to transfer her oldest to a more affordable school. A decision she hid behind explanations about wanting a different curriculum, though her strained smile suggested otherwise. Mark, who had always treated his truck as an extension of his ego, a gleaming showpiece he used to project authority, listed it for sale on a community board and settled for far less than he once declared it was worth. And when I heard from a distant cousin that he now drove an older car he claimed he preferred, I felt no triumph. Only the quiet knowledge that the world was finally meeting him honestly. Through all of this, I maintained my distance, not out of cruelty, but out of survival understanding that stepping back allowed the truth to do what it had been waiting years to do. Because betrayal, family karma, rarely arrives as a dramatic blow. It arrives as a slow erosion of the privileges people once took for granted, and as their lives adjusted to the consequences they had sown, I continued building my own life with a sense of steadiness that felt almost foreign after years of instability. There were moments when distant relatives reached out with questions curious about the rift, curious about the truth behind the Hillcrest silence. But I answered gently, telling them I wished everyone well, while making it clear I was no longer available to carry burdens that had never been mine to hold, and in those quiet responses, I felt a kind of peace I had never known. Each evening, when I returned to my apartment overlooking the water, I brewed tea and watched the lights shimmer across the lake, and though I knew the final chapter had not yet been written, the fallout unfolding before me was enough to remind me that truth does not need to shout to be heard. It simply waits for the right moment to reveal itself, and in that waiting, the balance finally settles steady and undeniable. In the months that followed the unraveling of everything my family once used to measure their worth, I found myself settling into a life that felt strangely quiet in the beginning, yet slowly grew into a rhythm that wrapped around me, with a kind of steadiness I had never been allowed to experience. And each morning when I stepped out onto the balcony of my new apartment overlooking Lady Bird Lake, I felt the soft shimmer of water, reflecting a calmness I had earned not through loud victories, but through the long discipline of choosing myself again and again, even when no one else did. My days filled with work that challenged me in ways that energized rather than drained me, and I began mentoring younger women in finance and analytics, especially those who came from families where their ambitions had been dismissed as hobbies or quirks, and as I guided them through contracts and compensation structures and long-term planning, I felt a sense of quiet justice, knowing I was helping them build storied financial foundations no one could strip from them. In those sessions, we rarely spoke about my past, but when they mentioned their own moments of feeling small or unseen, I recognized the echoes instantly and offered not solutions wrapped in anger, but direction wrapped in dignity. And with each conversation, I understood more clearly that healing sometimes looks like lifting others so they never have to crawl through the same tunnels you once did. A year after the Hillcrest night, I received a call from the nursing home letting me know that my grandmother, Ruth, had passed peacefully in her sleep. And although we had not been able to spend as much time together as I wished, I felt her loss heavier than I expected, because she had always been the single thread of gentleness woven through a family fabric full of sharp edges, and I traveled to her small room carrying flowers she used to love breathing in the soft lavender scent that always reminded me of her. The executor handed me a small envelope with my name written in her handwriting and a copy of her simple will, and though she did not have much, she left me a modest amount, along with the note she had once told me about the one that mattered far more than any inheritance. And when I opened the letter, I felt her presence settle around me as I read her words, saying she saw me, she believed in me, and she wished she could have protected me from the weight of what the family became. I folded the letter gently, and when I returned home, I placed it beside the signed contract representing the $4.8 million deal that had changed the trajectory of my life. And the contrast between the two pieces of paper struck me deeply because one represented what I had built on my own, while the other represented the recognition I had wanted, but never received from the people who should have offered it freely. Standing there, I realized that the healing I had been moving toward was not about forgetting the past or erasing the people who harmed me. It was about acknowledging the truth that the most meaningful validation often comes from the quietest voices, and I whispered to myself that at least one person in this family understood I was not a problem to be fixed, but a consequence of the seeds others had sown. After her funeral, I continued building my boundaries with a clarity that felt almost radical after years of being told that boundaries were disrespectful. And while I did not cut my parents or Heather off entirely, I carved out a space between us that protected my peace, and I held firm to it regardless of the guilt layered onto me through messages and half-hearted invitations. I decided I would not lend money, not sign papers, not join any family funds masquerading as unity, and when they hinted about bridging the gap or returning to how things once were, I gently reminded them that the past was shaped by their choices, not mine, and I was no longer willing to shrink to fit into their expectations. Over time, they adjusted, not because they accepted, but because they realized their old tactics no longer worked, and I learned to interact with them from a distance defined by respect rather than fear, offering polite conversations and brief visits without stepping back into the patterns that once consumed me. At night, when I sat by the window overlooking the lake, I often reflected on the long arc that had carried me from being the quiet daughter, dismissed as odd, to becoming a woman who built her own stability without relying on a family that believed love was conditional on obedience. And I thought about the viewers who would eventually hear this story. Many of them, women and men between 45 and 70, who had lived through their own versions of toxic family dynamics where emotional resilience was forged, not in comfort, but in the years spent absorbing unkindness in silence. To them, I wanted to say that dignity over money is not a slogan, but a choice we make every day when we refuse to trade our self-respect for a brittle form of belonging, and that revenge through truth is not about tearing others down, but about standing in the light of your own reality so fully that their narratives fall apart without you ever having to raise your voice. Quiet justice is not dramatic. It is not cinematic in the way people expect revenge to be. It is the slow, consistent alignment of actions, boundaries, and truth until the people who tried to define you are forced to face the consequences of their own behavior. And once healing begins to settle into the spaces where pain used to live, the world feels different in the gentlest way. And if you have lived through your own quiet justice, your own silent revenge against a toxic family, if you have carried your story alone for years because you believe no one would understand, share a line of your truth below, because emotional resilience grows when we realize we are not the only ones who learn to stand alone, and dignity over money becomes easier to choose when a community reminds us that self-respect is worth far more than forced loyalty. This channel exists to honor those stories, to hold space for those who reclaimed respect in the face of family betrayal, to show that justice without hate is possible, and that closure arrives not when others apologize, but when you no longer need them to. And if this journey of revenge through truth spoke to something in you, do not forget to subscribe and stay with us for more stories of quiet justice and the karma that always follows in its own time.